Well, it's good to be with you this afternoon. You know, how often is it that we hear when we turn on the news or we turn on the radio in our cars, that we hear news about things that have gone well? Most of the time, in fact, I would say 99.9% of the time, what we hear about is some tragedy, some horrible problem, some terrible issue where things did not go well. In fact, things went really poorly. And so we just don't really hear very much good news. And I think the same carries over into our understanding of post-conflict societies. And when we look at subjects like how do we stop genocide from occurring, how do we build peace, we have a tendency to want to research what went wrong. We want to really concentrate on the problem and how to solve problems. And the result of that, of course, is we tend to create some really negative thinking. In fact, you know, there's a whole area of practice that I'm a student of now called appreciative inquiry that was created up at Case Western Reserve University. David Cooper Ryder, Mark Chupp, and others up there have written a good bit about that and speak on it and teach on it a good bit. And one of the things that they remind us is that we're just too good in our society at dissecting problems. But when we do that, it really doesn't unleash creativity. So I'd like to tell you a story in the next few moments about a place where I've been where things really went right. And I've been fascinated by this story for quite some time because it's a story about how people in a particular part of Croatia chose peace at a time when everyone else was choosing violence and war. Gorsky-Kotar is a province or state in the south of Croatia. And it's in the mountains, but it also extends down to the coastline at the upper end, the northern end of the Dalmatian coast. And back in the early 90s, when Croatia declared its independence from Yugoslavia, there was an immediate, of course, response from what was left of Yugoslavia, from Serbia, and it's what led to the war between the Serbs and the Croats. But one thing that occurred that was pretty awful was that as soon as Croatia declared its independence, the Serbs who had lived there for hundreds of years were suddenly confronted by their Croat neighbors and told to go home. Croats went to neighboring villages where Serbs and their families had been for, like I said, for hundreds of years, and literally went to them with guns and said, "You've got to leave this country. You don't belong here anymore." And so that happened all over Croatia, except in Gorsky-Kotar. And in Gorsky-Kotar, a critical mass of the citizens of Gorsky-Kotar decided they wanted peace. And Gorsky-Kotar has been known ever since as an oasis of peace in the middle of the wars of the 90s that, of course, led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed and many, many more being displaced. And so I want to tell you a little more about what happened in Gorsky-Kotar because we've had the opportunity to interview and meet with three key leaders from that region. One of them is a man named Franjo Starčević. Franjo was a wonderful fellow. In fact, when I first met him, my impression immediately was this is probably the way St. Francis of Assisi would come across. He was just the most gentle soul I've ever met. And one of the things that Franjo did when all of this violence began to erupt across Croatia was that he walked into Serb villages, sometimes walking many miles to do this. But he would walk into a Serb village and ask to meet with the leaders of that village, with the mayor. And he was there for two reasons. One, to assure them that they were going to be safe in in their village, which was part of Gorsky-Kotar, and to help put together a communications network so that if there was some incident that occurred in Gorsky-Kotar, that they would immediately be able to get all these mayors on the phone and get the true facts out of what had occurred. Because as all of us who have ever played the game of gossip know, things have a tendency of getting blown out of proportion. The other thing that Franjo did was that he started a school for peace right in the middle of the war between Croatia and Serbia. And it was a boarding school down on the coast, and Serb and Croat teenagers came together in this boarding school to learn peacemaking, and I'm sure other subjects. But the purpose of it was to literally be a countermeasure to what was occurring elsewhere in Croatia and elsewhere in the former Yugoslavia. And another person that I met there was a lady named Nada Glad. And Ms. Glad was the station manager for the local radio station, Radio Delnica, Delnica being the capital of Gorsky-Kotar. And when Croatia declared its independence, there was a good bit of martial music, very sort of incendiary programming being pushed out to the radio stations from the capital city of Zagreb. And Ms. Glad just decided not to put that on the radio. And so she replaced the programming that she was being handed by the Tudjman government, that was all about whipping people into a war frenzy, and instead replaced it with programming that was intended to, one, be calming, but also very practical, like what do we do if the lights go out? What do we do if our sanitation facilities and water facilities are bombed and you can no longer turn on a tap and expect water? Just basic survival skills in the middle of a war. And of course, her work in doing that helped to create this atmosphere of we don't have to go that direction. We don't have to go toward war. And then another person who was very important in all of this was a fellow named Josip Horvats. And Mr. Horvats was an official in the Gorsky-Kotar government. And he became concerned because in the capital city of Delnica, there was a army base. And of course, this was a Yugoslavian army base, and it was a munitions depot, huge warehouses full of munitions, bombs, and it was being guarded by a garrison of Yugoslavian army soldiers. And of course, when all these various countries, including Croatia, declared their independence, then the soldiers who were part of that garrison from other countries just simply deserted and left. So of course, the only folks left in the garrison were all Serbs, and they were a heavily armed group. And the concern, there were of course multiple concerns, but one of the concerns that Mr. Horvats had was, what if this group decided to attack the citizens of Delnica? But he was just as concerned that citizens of Delnica would attack them. And so he went and began meeting with the commandant of that base, and over a period of 6 months built real bridges of trust with him and won his trust, and so set up a process of communication so that if there were any incidents, they would immediately be able to address them. In fact, an incident did occur, and one of the soldiers was shot and injured by one of the local citizens. And immediately the response was to write a letter to the commandant that was signed by all the local mayors and by Mr. Horvats apologizing for that injury. And this was read on the radio again, from Radio Delnica. But the other thing that Mr. Horvats did was he began to realize that at some point the Serbian Air Force would show up, or these fellows would receive orders to blow up the munitions depot to keep it out of the hands of the Croatian army. And so he began to negotiate with the commandant. And eventually the deal that he was able to cut with him was that the commandant turned the base over to Mr. Horvats personally. And Mr. Horvats, in return, gave the soldiers their money and civilian clothing and helped to smuggle them out of the country so that they would not end up in concentration camps in Croatia, which is what was happening elsewhere. And so that's exactly what they did. And he turned the base over to him. Mr. Horvat's somehow put together about 50 trucks to take those munitions out of the middle of his capital city of Delnica and move them up into the mountains. And they were about 90% through that process when the Serbian Air Force showed up and to bomb the base. And so they did do that. And in fact, the people who were there at the time said that when the bombs began to fall on the munitions depot, every window in Delnica was shattered from the reverberations. So you can imagine how awful it would have been had those munitions warehouses been full of bombs and ammunition, as they had been. So Mr. Horvat's, by doing this, of course, saved his city from destruction. But it was also, again, very much a part of this integrated effort of so many different individuals to seek peace at a time when everyone else in Croatia was seeking war. And so one reason why I love this story is because, one, it tells me that peace building is possible. Peace building is about somehow, some way, creating a movement that will generate a critical mass of individual citizens in a society who decide that they want to come together with those who have been their enemies or are perceived as the other, and begin to work on, do the really hard work of envisioning a common future and then working toward that common future together. And when I first heard this story, I was in Gorsky-Kotar at the Rom Peace Project, meeting with young people from all of the countries of the former Yugoslavia who had come together again to envision a common future and begin to talk about how to build bridges of trust and reconciliation, and then begin to work toward that. And it was hearing the story of Gorsky-Kotar that inspired me to think, you know, this is possible. This can be done intentionally, but it requires us not just to think about what went wrong. It requires us to take a really hard look at what went right and how to duplicate that in other places. And truly, this story was, I think, it was a major inspiration for me in deciding to start the Institute for Sustainable Peace. And because peace building is about societal transformation, Gorsky-Kotar is a society that was transformed. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this story with you.